Welcome to the Create What You Speak podcast. Join me as we have a real-life discussion on how to change your life by changing your thoughts. Remember, question everything, trust yourself, and find your truth. Welcome to the Create What You Speak podcast. My name is Sloan Fremont, and I'm your host. This is the show where we explore all the things that go on in our minds that actually maybe don't feel like it, but are the things that create our reality. And that goes for the good things and the bad things. And today I am so excited to welcome back Lawrence Rook. Lawrence has been a guest of the show before, and I love talking with him. I wanted to have him back so we could continue our conversation and dig into a little bit more of what I talked about in the intro of the show about what our thoughts are, how we use our thoughts, and are we using them in the right way? And Lawrence is the author of the book, Your Money, Your Mind, How Open Skeptical Thinking Improves Your Life and can protect you from the pandemic wealth transfer. Lawrence, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Sloan. Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, so why don't we start out, for those maybe who didn't hear our previous interview, can just tell the audience just a little bit about yourself and the premise for your book, Your Money, Your Mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've always had a interest and background in working with people. I'm an alternative therapist and have always worked with people. And when I started digging in and questioning the COVID narrative, I found that so much of it could be explained through a monetary lens. Mm-hmm. And through being an alternative therapist, I spent years and years around very alternative people who would be very questioning, think outside the box, they'd go against the mainstream, and they'd be really aware of corruption in systems. So they'd be aware of corruption in government, they'd be aware of corruption in healthcare, but people wouldn't really know the levels and intricacies of the corruption in our financial system.
Yeah. And
myself was included in that. And really, when I started to look into COVID, I delved into economics for the first time. And I just was able to kind of unravel it in the same way that you can unravel any kind of narrative for a mainstream system. And I think what I found was once you know how that system works, you can then choose to sidestep it, choose to be independent of it, and actually choose to take control of your life, your sovereignty, and in this case, your wealth and your money once you understand how that works. So basically, I wrote this book for alternative people who want to very simply understand how the financial system is corrupt and what they can do to protect themselves from this wealth transfer that we're experiencing.
Yeah, and I know I mentioned this last time. What I loved about your book is how succinct you were. You took very complex information, topics, and you boiled it down into such easy to understand descriptions and explanations that anybody could pick this up, read the book, get a really good idea of, okay, this is what I'm concerned about right now, and go off on their path and adjust, correct that. And then keep working until they have a more holistic, maybe plan for their financial self. And not only that, but for their own individual sovereignty, as you mentioned, because that, to me, you've got to kind of get that going in your mind and understand that and really know what that means for you before you can start to work outwards, right? Because if you're still feeling inside that you belong in the system or in the matrix, or I often call it that on the show, then it's going to feel weird to go out and do these quote alternative things, right? Because you're not really bought into it yet, right? But when you get the true understanding of what's going on, and you kind of work backwards then into yourself, and you can start to do things differently, think about things differently, and really your worldview is completely changed. Then you kind of have that understanding of, okay, this is why I can do these things. This is why I want to do these things. And this is how it's going to benefit me.
Yeah. Really well said. And I completely concur with that. And for the intro of the book, I discussed these kind of philosophical things about what it means to actually be somebody who's seeking truth, somebody who wants to understand what's really going on in the world and the challenges that poses. And really, I see it as like a spiritual quest, because seeking truth in the outside world is a process of discovery, and truth very often in our lives can be very painful.
Yeah.
And, you know, if we find out our partner's having an affair, if we find out a friend has lied to us, if we find out that, you know, we've been deceived or conned in any kind of way, all of these things can be truths that are actually quite painful. And for a long time, psychologically, people can live in states of denial to protect themselves from the truth.
Yeah.
And it's really an inward journey of sort of awakening that allows people to kind of break free of those defense mechanisms and allow them to kind of see what's really going on in their life. And, you know, it can cause a crisis, it can cause the end of a marriage, it can cause the breakdown of business, whatever it is. And what I see going on in the outside world is the same kind of psychological process, but sort of externalized. There are some people who are ready to face the truth and are kind of psychologically at that place where they're able to accept it. And there are some people who are kind of spiritually more close to it, and they're not really ready to see beyond the veil or to step out of the matrix, so to speak. And it's a really challenging one because, of course, it affects everybody. But I think ultimately it's a personal journey. And if there's a reason why somebody refuses to see truth, it's probably for a reason that psychologically, if they did see it, they wouldn't even be able to handle it. It would be too much for them. They would lose too much. So that's what the first part of my book is about. And I really wrote it for alternative people who want to understand and think about why it is that somebody close to them, somebody in their family, just can't see what they can see. And then also then I supplement that with the financial side so that hopefully they can have some big benefit from being an open and skeptical thinker.
Yeah. And so last time we touched on both. We got into a little bit about the spiritual side, the skeptical side, and then we focused on the financial side. And I wanted to have you back today to talk just about the spiritual and that skeptical, the truth finding, that piece. And so for anybody who hasn't listened to our previous episode, I'm going to link to that in the show notes. So please be sure and go back and listen to that because that was such a great interview. We had such a great conversation. But today I want to start out by talking about that first part of your book about having an open and skeptical mind. And as you mentioned about truth, and when you were talking about as a person goes on this spiritual journey and all these breakdowns, what I would say also, and what I experienced was the breakdown of self, like the breakdown of what I thought to be true, realizing it wasn't, realizing the layers upon layers of scams, I'll just use as a word, right, to summarize everything that I became aware of. And that is a terrible process to go through, but a necessary one if we're going to decide to find truth, follow truth, figure out what truth means to us. And that breakdown of self, I think I remember getting to a point where I felt like I don't know what to believe anymore. I think I even did a show on it. I don't know what to believe anymore. And almost like I believe nothing. Like I got to the bare essence of I have no belief about anything. And I went through that for a period of time. And I felt like it was necessary to do that to kind of wipe away or like have a clean slate to start believing things differently or looking at things differently. And so when we go through this, and the listeners are probably at varying stages of awakening, of maybe digging into truth. One thing when it comes to truth and searching and finding, one of the big questions that I went through was, how do I know this is true? If everything before was a lie, how do I know that this new information that I'm seeking is actually true? And how would you maybe answer that? Or how has that experience been for you, especially when you were researching your book?
Yeah. I mean, I guess there are different ways in which we can come to truth. And truth can be determined in different ways. So first and foremostly, you'd have things like scientific truths, and these could be established through scientific research and peer-reviewed journals and things like this. And of course, if the research is done properly and credibly, that would be arguably a source of good truth. But it's not limited to that. You can have journalistic truths, and you can have eyewitness truths. You can have truths from accounts of parents, you know, in relation to whatever they've experienced with their child. and things like this. So there's many different ways in which you can research information. And when it comes to finding out what's going on in the external world, you need to be able to look at all sources, and you need to be able to evaluate things in a fair kind of way. Because if one only gets hung up on scientifically reviewed, peer published and assessed papers, then, well, what about eyewitness accounts? And what about documentaries? And what about evidence outside of that kind of scientific establishment, all of which can help you point to an established truth. But what I would say is that truth can be established very methodically. And this is the way that I would like to determine things. Obviously, I think as humans, we've all got powers to kind of intuit things. But very, very simply, if a narrative holds, it should be built from the bottom up. So it should be built from the bottom up with facts, not from the top down. And I think COVID is a complete example of how the narrative and what's been going on is being given to us from top down. But when you examine the facts, they don't add up. Right. So science, facts, and a narrative fundamentally should be built from the bottom up. And if we build things from the bottom up, forget the narrative, forget the ideology, forget the story, let's just look at the facts, what we know, then we can assess and develop a bigger picture.
Yeah. And with that too, I think there's also the personal experience or the personal truths that we may have happen in any given situation, right? If somebody's telling you that, bodies are dropping in every city in America, and you look outside and everybody's running and healthy and, happy and having a great time, then you may want to question the source of that information. Right. But and that's what I did a lot through when all this started was, I would look around and what's my experience with this? Like, I'm hearing this, I'm seeing this, like, am I just getting like a narrow view from, somebody who's trying to promote fear? Am I just getting, somebody trying to sell me something, right? The sensationalism to get me in fear to buy whatever product they're trying to sell. But one thing that I've noticed over the past, several months is seeing people searching for truth, as we all are, right? And everybody wants to know and understand. And there's a lot of information out there. But even in the so-called, I would say the alternative media, right? These people that started maybe with one intent in mind, but over time have grown into questionable sources themselves as alternative media people. And what I see a lot is people flocking to alternative media and assuming because the mainstream media is false, then that means that the alternative media should be true. And I think that is a very dangerous path to go down. I think it's very, there's a lot of things going on there too, that if you look at those things and you think intuitively, see what it feels like to you, you can see some of the falsities in that too. And I just find it really interesting that we have like this one or the other belief often, right? It's easy to fall into that. Well, if one is true, then the other must be false. Or if one is false, the other must be true. And that to me doesn't feel right either.
It's very dualistic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very binary.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think people need to, as you say, be aware and kind of check themselves, because ultimately, I think this is all a spiritual progress, a spiritual process. And as a spiritual process, it's perhaps best not to see it in terms of sides or in division, because then you instantly fall into somewhat of a tribalistic mindset. You fall into a good and bad mindset, a kind of enemy, and then the anger starts to come.
Right.
You want to be able to discern and kind of rise above those kind of polarized narratives, because if we are polarized, of course, it means that people can divide and rule, so to speak.
Yeah. And it's, I know for myself, and I think a lot of people, we were all looking for this, like, where do I belong now? right? Everything fell apart, and everything I thought was real, or I thought I felt maybe security in, or I felt like these were my people. Now I don't know who my people are anymore. So where do I belong, right? Do I belong over here with this group, or do I belong over here with that group? And I went through a lot of that myself, like feeling very much like lost at sea. Like, I don't know. But then as I went experienced this more, and I went through, everything that we all went through, I started to realize that I'm not like, I don't have to necessarily belong to one group. Like, I get information from a lot of different groups, but I don't really call myself part of any group anymore, if that makes sense, right? I'm taking pieces of what makes sense to me. I used to say it on the show all the time: take what works for you and leave the rest, right? Because and I really meant that, right? Take what I'm saying that works for you, but if it doesn't resonate with you, or if it doesn't work for you, then leave it on the table and move on to the next thing. And I find that it's really easy, especially when you think about that duality, or those polars that are often encouraged, that when, like, maybe you have somebody that you feel like you can trust, and you get information from them, if they say one thing that you don't agree with, then it's very easy to dismiss that person and be like, well, all their information is wrong. But what I've started to do, and I found very beneficial in this process of seeking truth and deciding what truth is for me, is even if I don't agree with somebody on something, I understand their side of it, and I can see why, maybe why they think that, or what they use as their supporting evidence. But then I'm not so much like dismissing people just because we're not 100% in agreement all the time on everything anymore. I'm taking those bits and pieces from people, and with that, creating like what I feel like is information, or I'm doing things that are supporting me, whereas in the past I was doing things that I felt like were consuming me or driving me down, because I was always seeking, or always looking, or wanting the information from this person or that person. And I even said to one of my friends, I'm never going to be satisfied with the answers that I'm getting. So it's time for me to go, figure, like, for me, what does this mean for me? And that has been very helpful in this, to be able to take what works and leave the rest. Really, that's how I would summarize it.
Yeah. So many different thoughts I had when you're speaking there, about really interesting areas. So in terms of this letting go process that you sort of speak about, I mean, that's such a universal kind of occurrence, and it absolutely is. It's kind of letting go of a literal identity, and it's letting go of an ego. Because what happens is that people form their identity based on structures that they know in the external world. So if somebody is a successful banker, for example, they're going to have beliefs about the banking system and beliefs about the company they're working for, which then reflect who they are, and they can feel good about their identity because they understand and trust the so-called systems or whatever it is around them, and those things are all in place. Exactly the same as somebody's married to a woman for 30 years or something. They've got 2 kids. They know who they are in relation to that, and the woman is somebody who they know and represents their past and their future, etc. Then when a conspiracy happens, or some truth comes in, and the narrative breaks down, all of a sudden that person who's working in the bank realizes that their boss is completely corrupt, and the company they're working for doesn't have any ethics, and all of a sudden they lose their sense of identity because their external world is kind of collapsing. Exactly the same as the person in the marriage. They find out their wife isn't who they thought they are. They lose their past, because all of those family holidays, they don't mean anything anymore, because she's been cheating on him for however many years. He loses his future, and all of a sudden that is an existential crisis. And what happens with something like COVID, when people start to see through it, it creates this existential crisis, because the world they knew isn't there anymore, and therefore they are not the same, because who are they in relation to this new world? It's like being dropped in the middle of a different planet. Nobody knows you anymore, and everything has to be relearned. So it's a very scary process, and it can be a very scary process. But what I would say is that if you actually learn to love that process and see it as being a very freeing, very liberating thing, where you get to shed the old you and you get to kind of have a rebirth kind of all the time, it's incredibly fulfilling. What did you mention after that? You were talking about
well, we were talking about, where do I belong? And then I was talking about like,
where do I belong?
Yeah. And the polarizing of feeling like everyone has to 100% be on, we have to believe everybody 100%, and so take what works and leave the rest.
Yeah, that's it. Take what works and leave the rest. Yeah, which is a really good phrase. So what people tend to do, and this is a human universal again, is they tend to externalize their identity onto other people who represent things that they would like to have. So they might see a sports star, and that would for them represent the alpha male, the masculine, the successful, the rich. So therefore they idolize that and they want to be that because that person represents all of those virtues that they want. And what we tend to do is we tend to kind of negate our own power, our own kind of like spiritual truth, and just follow other people and idolize other people. And we do that with everyone, society idolizes doctors, they idolize experts, they idolize this, that, and the other. And so what you're saying is that by taking little snippets from people, being discerning with information and not taking it from one kind of, demigod figure.
Guru, right, yes.
Guru, exactly, or celebrity or whoever it is. You're then able to come to your own assumptions and you're able to kind of be discerning with information. And again, just in relation to truth, I think something that is so powerful and so important is to always check one's own assumptions, because there's so much in everyone's thinking, of course my own included, where I will have a belief which I will then build up a lot of other narratives and other worldviews off of. But what happens is actually, if you go to that belief and you question that assumption, you might find it standing on nothing. And then another level disappears. And I think, a good example of that would be actually questioning and looking into germ theory itself.
Yes.
So germ theory would be an assumption of our societies. Everybody believes in germs. Everybody has been taught that word ever since they were 2 years old.
Right.
And actually, when you go and question, what actually is a germ? Where does a germ come from? Does a germ come from the soil? Or does a germ come from something, what actually is it? Then it then opens the door to another kind of expansive learning and growing space.
Yes, especially as that germ theory versus terrain theory. So maybe some of the listeners have heard of this or explored it, and I'm no expert in this topic, but it's that difference of something's attacking me from the outside coming in versus I have things going in my body as a result of the food that I eat, the stress that I'm under, the thoughts that I think, right? And the more layers for me have peeled away, the more that I go back to the belief, the understanding, and it's almost like laughable now to me, but everything starts with us, no matter what it is. It all comes from inside, and that goes for everything. And as I was doing the dishes the other day, and I'm thinking about this, and I just started laughing about it because I'm like, how much more obvious could it be now, right? When all these years, living with these blinders on and like flailing through life, right? And now I'm like, man, could it be any more obvious? And it's easy to laugh and smile about it now. Now, going through it the past 2.5 years was not easy, and I was definitely not smiling. But I think what you're talking about with those assumptions and feeling these these beliefs drop out, it kind of feels like a dropping out from under you almost. And it's like, well, damn, I thought I believed that, but that isn't true anymore. It requires a lot of rethinking of things and the willingness and the energy to rethink those things, those simple things that you used to do, right? Like go to the doctor for certain procedures or things, right? And when you start to look at some of this stuff, it's like, is that really what I should be doing? I mean, I don't know. I mean, obviously not giving any medical advice here, but there's some rethinking that happens that can be exhausting at first, but then it, like you're saying, it's very freeing. It's very much a, to me, it's like shedding, I think you said, like shedding these layers of these old beliefs that kept us in these states of fear, anxiety, and even like the constant seeking of more information. Like, I feel like I wasted a lot of time seeking information that I now see was unnecessary to seek, because it didn't matter in the end, right? It's as I've continued to go through this process and relearn things, I'm like, well, that doesn't even matter anyway, because my belief stops at the beginning of what they're trying to say. So I don't have to go look for these other things, because I know the foundational thing that they're trying to say is a lie. So it doesn't even cause me to have to go think about these other things, and I save my energy. It makes
discerning truth, actually, to go back to that first point, actually a lot simpler when you go to the very foundational assumption that it's all built on. And if you pull the carpet out from under germ theory, then how much time and energy do you save looking at other things
and money,
for example? Exactly. So it's important to be really stringent with your thinking.
And taking it all back to what we were saying about it all starts within. So then think about that from there. Okay, we were spending a lot of our time and energy on all this stuff outside of us, right? But if we start to think about everything happens within, and see this on a different level when we're talking about germ theory versus terrain theory versus any other thing that you want to think about in your life, then you start to readjust your, okay, so I'm not spending my money, for example, over here on X item. So that means I have more money to spend on maybe healthy food, right? I'm eating more things that are good for me. I'm spending more energy and time on things that are good for me, that are within my control, instead of sitting for hours scrolling on Telegram, reading doom and gloom, sensationalized alternative news. There's no value in that. There's no value to know. And half the stuff will be irrelevant in a day or two anyway, because there's going to be a different spin on it or a different story, right? And so we don't always have to be up to date on all of these stories that are being spun, right? To have a general understanding of what the tone is, or what people are saying. Okay, that's fine. But then, why not use our energy for those things that we can control and what we can take care of? That's something I've really been focusing on, because it feels very easy to get into that victim state, or there's nothing I can do about it, and all these things happening. But you do have your own span of control, and it starts with what you focus on.
I think you're so right. Yeah. And it can be addictive, I would say, from somebody who's been interested in following alternative news for years. You can really get caught up with the everyday, and as you say, following Telegram and stuff. But understanding that it all comes from within is so important. And in our society, that's not given credence at all. I think we live very much in like a collectivist era, where the individual isn't really given as much power, autonomy, or sort of freedom as I think it deserves. And everything that we have is kind of currently politically looked at with a collectivist mentality. So people are talked about and defined by their groups. They're talked about and defined by their race, or by their gender, or by, whatever it is. And everything's kind of talked about in groups. And what that does is it diminishes the individual. It diminishes the power of the individual. And we're kind of taught to think that the way in which kind of we affect things is by having these different groups that are kind of warring with each other, when the reality is, everything does come from within. And if we all focus on self-cultivation and ways in which we can transform and manifest our life, and kind of vote with our life, vote with our behavior for what we want, that's the way the world is going to change. And that's the way in which, exponential progress is going to be made for everyone. And I think once you have an understanding, a deep understanding of what's really going on, and you've done that work, you've gone to your assumptions, you've checked them, and you've got the narrative, then you don't need to be scrolling through Telegram constantly every day. You can now use that information to make your life better. And that's what has to happen. It's like, there's no point in me spending a year and a half researching the financial system if it doesn't benefit me. Or
if you just sit there and continue to research it and be angry about it.
Because it just festers more disempowerment. And I think part of this whole kind of new world order type thing is built on the fact that these people are all powerful. And of course, you know, they're really not. You know, we're the ones with power.
Like what you hear so far? Take what you've learned and invest in yourself with the Create What You Speak Academy. Visit createwhatyouspeak.com to learn more. Now back to the show.
To sort of give an example from my own life, you know, when I sort of figured out what was going on with this whole COVID situation, me and my family moved to the countryside, and we swapped our house in the city for a smaller cottage, but with lots and lots of land. Mm-hmm. And we wanted to then become self-sufficient, build a community, and try to live in a much more kind of like rural, natural, kind of organic way, making connections from the grassroots, which is exactly what they were trying to stop with all the lockdowns and things. And by putting my energy into something very positive and putting it into something that's creative, you know, I can then kind of manifest the kind of world that we would all want. And that's absolutely what people had to start doing.
Right. And I think what you were talking about with the alternative news and, like I mentioned, the scrolling, I mean, those dopamine hits that you get from that, right? They know that it's the same as the mainstream media that you try to, there's no difference here. And I've often said, you know, people say that they don't want COVID to end, like the side that supports various things. But I think the other side doesn't want it to end either, because they're equally as bought in. They're making money in various ways, and they're getting content out there that are getting, you know, people are consuming. But I think that and
their identities are invested in it as well.
Right.
Like they have built up a very strong identity of, I am anti this, I don't believe that, this is how it is, and I am going to fight to the death.
Yes.
And, you know, I mean, I think it's admirable in many ways, but they need to be able to let it go and transcend it when needed.
Right. And that's, you don't grow by staying in that same place of hate and rage and whatever, you know, people have been through feeling with this. But I think when you were mentioning about having people warring with each other, right? Like on those dualities and, well, this group, you know, I identify with this group and this is what's happening to them, or, you know, two sides are at war or whatever. When we're constantly having our energy chasing that or keeping up with it or fighting against it, that subtracts our energy from being able to do the productive things like you were talking about with moving and creating that life that you want, that more natural life that is sustaining for you. And I think being able to put the energy into those things that are beneficial for us, even understanding when maybe you have situations where people are draining the energy from you, right? And sucking the life out of you, right? Because they're wanting to maybe trauma dump on you because they're still pissed about whatever is going on in the world, right? Like we have to be able to put boundaries around that and be able to really conserve our energy in a way that benefits us, because nobody's going to come here and knock on your door and say, today's the day everything's okay and you get to live like you want to, right? Because we live in a world where we're not, this is the world, right? It's differences night and day throughout the world, right? We have variety, right? That's what the world is. We don't want to live in this vanilla world where everybody thinks the same, like a robot, right? Like that's what I think most people are against. So nobody's going to knock on your door and say, everything's clear, come out and start living your life, right? Today is the day you live your life, right? You get out there, you start doing these things that are beneficial to you. Yes, all this other shit is going on. It's still happening. It's enraging. It's saddening. It's all these things, but what control do you have over it? And if your answer is no to that, then why not start focusing on these things that you do have the control over, that you can make a difference in, and that do support from the inside out, right? You start with it within and start eating healthier, you know, getting exercise. Those are two very controllable things that you can do, and getting more sleep, right? That would be another one. And so I think this reminder of that, and that's one of the things I really have tried on my Telegram channel and on my social media and on the show. I don't want to be a doom and gloom person that comes on here and just parrots what other sites have said about the terrible things going on, right? I want the show to be about solutions. That's what I want to be able to offer to people. I want to be able to remind people of the things that I also need to be reminded of, of focusing on what I can control. And so I think this being able to put your energy in places that benefit you, instead of letting energy get sucked out of you, maybe in ways you don't even notice, is such a huge shift that most people would benefit from if they had the awareness and paid attention to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was a little soapbox moment there, but
No,
it
totally,
needed to be
totally. And
said.
again, there's so much interesting stuff to sort of comment on and kind of continue with. I think I think well, okay. So firstly, the kind of analogy I would think about is if somebody had a kind of a traumatic event that happened to them, or they were angry maybe with their parents because they didn't feel they treated them right when they were growing up or something. As an adult, you have the ability to reflect on that, acknowledge that it wasn't what you would have wanted, but then you choose how to act. And if you acknowledge that traumatic process and you choose to act in a way that benefits you now as an adult in the future, you've just grown massively.
Right.
Because you've just experienced something and you've risen above it and acknowledged it, felt it. And when it comes to your own children, because you've acknowledged it, you're not going to repeat the same mistake.
Right. You let go of that generational trauma that a lot of people experience without even understanding that that's what it is.
Yeah. And you have to be able to grow from it and learn from it. That's the key thing from it. It's no good just acknowledging that your dad was a workaholic and he didn't emotionally connect with you, but then you just do the same with your child. You need to be wise. You need to be able to acknowledge it and be really conscious, and then step out and break that pattern.
Yeah.
And I would see it as being very similar with the outside world. We can all point fingers at traumatic events that are going on in the outside world that affect us. In the same way, we can all point fingers at our parents and say, look, that affected us. But the question is how are we now, as conscious, sovereign, independent adults, choosing to deal with those things? And it's how we deal with them which then determines how we grow. And there's a concept in psychology called post-traumatic growth, and it essentially is when something bad happens to us and we learn and grow from that experience. And nobody really in their life would say, right, I want to fall in love and have a really hard breakup so that I learn. But, everybody actually who falls in love and has a really hard breakup and learns after it will very often look back and say, that was the most important experience I've ever had.
Right.
And if you look back in your life, generally, people will say the most traumatic and difficult times are very often the ones that they grow and learn from the most, and they wouldn't trade for anything else. Right. And it's exactly the same with what's going on in the outer world.
Yeah.
We need to be able to see this as a traumatic time, but that trauma and the harshness of that reality points us in what we should be doing and where we should be going. Yes. Yeah, because we don't want that. So this is what we now want.
Yes, if we let it, right? If we can stay in the trauma and we can stay in the anger, the rage about it, but those experiences like you talk about, that's what I found. It pushes me in that direction. It pushes me in a way that I needed to go, that I already knew I needed to go, but I just wasn't taking the action on, right? And I know a lot of people experience that with jobs when they lost their jobs because they wouldn't get the vaccine. And many people that I talked to and just read stories about were like, it's the best thing that ever happened to me. But that lead up to it, the resistance to it, all this stuff that we don't want to feel. Once we let that go, I've often said the resistance is just the worst part of it. If we just feel it and get through it, it's so much easier and better than actually what we put ourselves through with resisting it.
Yeah, completely. And it's like, as people, I think we all find it actually really hard to know how to make ourselves happy and what we really want. Yeah. So an example of this is that me and my wife, we would always do a lot of traveling, and we would spend a lot of time in India. We spend a lot of time in Portugal, and we would go away quite a lot every year. Yeah. And because I wouldn't get the vaccine, I let my passport expire. And I said to myself, that's fine. I'm not going to travel for, whatever. I said 5 years in my head because I didn't know how long it's going to last. But I went with that. And I never thought that would make me happy because I love traveling. But as soon as I let go of it, I now feel so much more at peace because the option for traveling was closed. So therefore, I could get on with my life in the UK. I didn't have to moan about the weather because this is just what it was. Right. Whereas if I had the option to go abroad, that's always going to be niggling on me. So it's just a small example of how we don't really know what's good for us. And it's very hard for us to predict what we're going to grow from, what's going to make us happy, and what we actually need in life. You know, life is so much more wise than we are, right? The universe is smarter than that.
Yes, and I did love what you just said there about how we can't predict what we're going to grow from, because I had a very similar experience. I mean, I used to travel for my job every week in the US, and then I traveled even after that several times a month, right? I was on a plane very regularly, and working remotely, I could do that. And I refused to wear the mask. And so I wasn't flying on any planes. And at first that was I just was just like you. I was just resisting it. I just was so mad and upset and all these various things. And then when I let it go, I realized, man, how often was I traveling just to run from things, right? Run from feelings, like keep my emotion, like keep my mind busy, or feel like I had to travel to I was missing out on something, whatever the reason was, right? I realized all these things for why I was doing it. And now when I travel, I'm like, it's fine. It's great. I like, I'll drive somewhere. It's fine. But I'm not, it doesn't have that same pull like it used to, because I'm not trying to escape. That was how I used it, that I know in my life. I used it as an escape from things I didn't want to deal with, right? I didn't want to deal with maybe being at home alone, or being like, whatever it was, right? So that was very interesting to me as well with the travel, because it felt the same, but then so much that I learned from that of what I was doing as a coping mechanism, maybe.
Yeah, and it's really insightful, and it's such a good example, isn't it?
Yeah.
Of how, when you let that resistance go and basically put your morals as the number one thing, then things fall into place after. And anyone who's made sacrifices because of their morals and because of what they value to be the most important thing, I mean, I think that's just so fantastic and respectable, because I think people generally don't think about their morals enough, and in terms of their values, I don't think people place their morals highly enough. In terms of values, I think people would very often put money or status or their ego, essentially, as the most important thing. Hence why they will sometimes lie, or they'll cheat, or they'll go along with something even though they know it to be wrong, because they want to preserve their money, status, ego, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But when you make your morals the number one value on your kind of hierarchy, then everything else falls into place, because then you just don't compromise your morals, and then
you're not faking.
No matter what happens, you can hold your head up incredibly high. And really, is there anything worth sacrificing your morals for? Because money or fame or status, all of those things are transitory, and if you sacrifice your morals for any of those things, or a career or whatever, or a marriage even, then it's like, well, what happens when that ends? Then where are your morals now? And it's kind of like, all we've got is the person that we are. All we've got ultimately is our integrity. So that for me needs to be our defining feature and what we lead through life with.
Yeah. And I think what you're saying about sacrificing our morals, even if we sacrifice, that doesn't guarantee, if we sacrifice our morals, that doesn't even guarantee us we're going to get the thing that we want. Right. So we may sacrifice our morals and not even end up getting the thing we chase after. And then what are you left at? Right. What are you left with? You're left with yourself. And you have two chapters in your book, one about value systems and philosophy, and then another one about ideology, beliefs, and worship. And in the one about value systems and philosophy, you talk about how what people value the most dictates their actions and their direction in life. And what dictates their value system is their underlying philosophy. And so I think that's something also that when we think about morals and why we do what we do, reminding ourselves, maybe revisiting this topic with ourselves, like, is my morals still do I still believe the same thing I used to? Do I still have the same personal philosophy that I used to? Those are the questions I found I asked myself during all this. And I think revisiting that every once in a while is such a great way to see how far you've grown, and also get in touch with yourself to make sure that your actions are in alignment with that.
So it's so important. Yeah. And how many people do you think would say that, just kind of casually, that their driving force would be, I want to do good in the world? They would say that. I think most people would say that.
Yes.
Yeah. And then it's like, well, how true is that? And how stringent is that? And how much would they be willing, for example, to question their job for that? So, most people working, let's take an example, in the medical profession would probably say, I really want to do good in the world. That's my number one thing.
Right.
People that work in lots of different fields, might say that. But then what happens if you presented them with evidence, hard evidence, that directly showed that what they were doing professionally might be having a negative impact on the world? How many of those people would actually want to acknowledge it and absorb it and change it?
And
or how many of them would want to bury it?
Yeah.
And as soon as they want to bury it, that their sort of highest principle isn't to make the world a better place. Their highest principle is to maintain their status, or to maintain their income, or to maintain their ego in relation to what it is they're doing.
Or not make waves, right? Not make waves, or not, call attention.
Exactly.
Just let me fly under the radar and do my thing and leave me alone, right?
That's totally. So really, better. It's like, if people say anything, and if people kind of say to themselves, I want to change the world for the better, and they kind of just parrot that and they kind of just say it, if they haven't really thought about it, if they don't know what their underlying philosophy is, if they don't know really where that's coming from, then they might not be doing good in the world. They might actually be leading it towards a place that isn't so savory.
Yeah, or they're participating in the very thing that they're saying they don't believe in, right? And there's
exactly. Yeah.
I mean, and that goes along with this chapter on ideology and beliefs and worship. And you say that people would rather die than change their belief or ideology. And that is so true. I mean, you see examples of that all the time. I mean, people just won't let things go. And it's so interesting to me about how when you see somebody who's very bought into one side of things, maybe, and you believe the opposite, and then you see how you react to, to what they're saying, what they're doing. But then when somebody who doesn't believe what you do, when they consider your point of view, it's so interesting to me to see the polar opposites of points of view, because often people have the same common ground. They often have the same common ground. They may just not agree on, the approach or the direction or whatever, but everybody has the belief that they're right. Their way is right, and their way is going to save people, protect people, make it better, whatever it might be. But we're on opposite ends of the stick on the topic, right? And you think about that in this belief that, nobody's going to wave a wand over the world and get those people on the polar opposite of the ends of the stick to then come together and decide one or the other, right? And I used to say this to one of my friends, because she would talk about, and I'm not on Facebook and haven't been for a year or more, but my friend would talk about people arguing on Facebook, which is another energy waster and time drainer and all these other things. But I would say, who comes to Facebook to get their mind changed, right? Nobody. They come there to argue their point, right? And it's the same with any social media, right? We're not out here trying to, let me check Twitter today and see if I can get my mind changed, right? You're not doing that, right? And so, which side topic is such a waste of energy and time. But if you think about the differences in beliefs and how far off sometimes people are, and how far people are bought in. And I think you even touched on that in your book about, maybe doctors who are very knowledgeable maybe in one area, but so bought into it because they spent so many years, so much time, so much money, getting bought into it. Right. And I think realizing that or seeing that also helps in the energy wasting category, right? Because then you can see it's simply not worth your time to have those kinds of conversations. And what I found also in that approach is I'm very often don't encounter people where I would have that conversation. I'm more encountering people who are, not that I want to only talk to people who believe in me, but I'm not being, I'm not attracting or being around the ones that are very radical and want to just scream it in your face all the time.
Yeah, completely. It's a funny one when people engage constantly, like you say, in social media. Yeah, nobody's coming in there to have their mind changed. Nobody goes onto Facebook and then comes out kind of thinking like, oh yeah, wow, how could I have been so silly? Right. But I think what it does is it's a way of reaffirming again that identity. People are always looking to reaffirm their sense of who they are and essentially reaffirm their ego. And what these groups provide, and Facebook and etc., are just complete reassurance of who they are, who they are, who they are, and it's creating a strong affiliation with that identity. And the reason why I said in the book that people would rather die than change their ideology is kind of because sort of esoterically changing their ideology and a physical death are kind of the same thing, because they're both a complete death of the ego. And when you die, you let go of your identity. You are no longer, I am no longer Lawrence Rook when I die. That label, that kind of character I'm playing in this life dissolves, and then I would go back into expanded consciousness or something, or whatever people's belief is. And of course, if we take that doctor as an example, that doctor who spent, all of his money working through the system, competing in that system, striving to be in that system, and then finally getting acceptance within that medical system, for him then to come across a piece of information that kind of negates everything he's just been doing, all the blood, sweat and tears and all the money he's put in for the last 5 years, that is a type of death. It's a death of an identity, it's a death of an ego. And so people viscerally reject it, and they would attack something in the same way that they would attack someone trying to kill them in some kind of ways, because that they are defending their very existence when they're defending their cherished assumptions, is what I would call them.
And think about that with people who I even think prior to COVID, think about changes in your life, right? As you grow up through your life, right? We go through these phases where we are, maybe we go from being in high school to college, right? And that's that's an identity change right there, right? Or you go from like being a single person to a married person, right? That's an identity, or not having kids to being a parent, right? We go through these kinds of changes in these identity, these maybe not as extreme, but those kinds of things are a natural progression in life. And one thing I realized through all the work that I've done over the years is that I often treated change as if it was something wrong, like I was doing something wrong. Like if I changed my mind, oh my God, why are you changing your mind? You believe this, like what? Like, so there was like these little deaths within even little decisions that I had made, or changes that in my beliefs, or how maybe I approached the show, or whatever. And these changes, it's easy to fear them, but that's how we get to that place of what we say that we want, right? You don't stay the single person forever if your goal is to be married, right? You don't stay single and complain about being alone all the time if you have an opportunity to get married and then you say no, right? Like you have to go through the change to get to the thing that you want. And sometimes it can be scary. It can be all these different emotions, but that doesn't make it wrong. That doesn't mean it's bad. It's part of the process. And changing is, like I said, it's easy to fear it, but it's the positive part of the step that gets you going in that direction that you say you want to go.
Yeah. And it reminds me of you talking about resistance earlier.
Yeah.
Whereby, it's not the change that's ever hard. It's the resistance to the change that's hard. And I guess in our society, maybe we don't have a kind of a deep-rooted belief and trust in change, and maybe we don't acknowledge how important change is. I mean, we certainly don't deal with death appropriately, I don't think, in our society. And that's just a change. So we should celebrate change, like genuinely celebrate change as always a time for shedding and allowing the new in and the new growth, because we never want to get too attached to any belief, any ideology, or any identity. This is a key thing. If we attach too strongly to an identity, then we become fixed and rigid. And then when change occurs, we resist it because we're clinging on to whatever identity that is, be it an identity in a job, a role in a family, I'm married, I'm a father, whatever the identity is. That's all just, part of a play. It's how we need to see it. And we need to be able to step far back from it and just see it as part of the flow. Yeah,
I agree. Unfortunately, we're coming up on our time. This went really fast. So I'll get ready to wrap up here. But before I do, I wanted to leave the listeners with probably one of the my favorite line in your book. It's at the beginning, and when you're writing about the foreword to the book, but you say power is always with the individual and the people, and we always have choices and ways to improve our lives. And I just wanted to leave everyone with that thought today as a reminder, as a, if you're hearing this, if you've been feeling like you don't have control over things, power is always with the individual and the people. We always have choices and ways to improve our lives. So what can you do today to start improving your life? I think that I love this sentence. So I wanted to end with that today.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, it's really meaningful. Thank you.
Lawrence, thank you again for joining us today. Lawrence is the author of Your Money, Your Mind, and we've been talking all kinds of things today. I'm not even sure what I'm going to call this episode because we've went in so many ways today, but this was such an amazing conversation. I'm so glad you came back to talk with us. Yeah, no, it's been great to be here, and always great to talk. Do you want to tell the listeners where they can find out more about you and your book? Yeah, absolutely. So my website is lawrencerook.com, and my book can be found on all online bookstores. Okay, awesome. I'll link to that in the show notes so the listeners can find that. And you've been listening to the Create What You Speak podcast, brought to you by webtalkradio.net. You can also hear the podcast on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and your favorite podcasting platform. I'm Sloan Fremont, and I hope you'll join me for the next episode of the Create What You Speak podcast, where we will continue to free our minds, expand our consciousness, and untangle those thoughts and patterns that keep us from living the life we desire. Check out my website, sloanfremont.com, to learn more.